Right, welcome back. Part 2 of Atonement lecture on context. As you recall, last time we were talking about metafiction, which is an absolutely key element of atonement. And we said that metafiction is a work of literature which draws attention to its own fictionality. We were talking about the fact that students in particular, I think, are often very irritated by metafiction, because we come to trust a narrator. We often immerse ourselves in a story. And then when you're told that in fact the story is fiction, you might actually experience a sense of distrust, a sense of disappointment. And that's precisely what metafiction does. It draws attention to the fact that stories often immerse us and we escape into them. And metafiction, on the other hand, reminds you that you shouldn't believe it. That Cecilia and Robbie are not real people. They're literary constructs. Metafiction is a key element of postmodern literature. It's where the writer draws attention to, I am only writing a story. And we were talking earlier about the fact that postmodernism in general embraces the idea of allowing popular culture into it. And so postmodernism is a much wider term than metafiction. Metafiction is more of a kind of formalist convention where the author shows themselves and draws attention to the constructedness of the text. Okay. Why is this so important? Why do we need to know about this? Because I would say that the most beautiful scene in part 3 of Atonement follows, I'll just quickly go back. We have the ugly, nasty, sordid scene, don't we, where she goes and watches the wedding of Paul Marshall and Lola, which is a sort kind of horrible hiding of sexual abuse kind of marriage, isn't it? And we sum it up by this wonderful quotation, walled up within the mausoleum of their marriage. She watches that, and that then is juxtaposed with this incredibly beautiful scene in which Robbie and Cecilia are seen together. What I like about the scene is that Robbie continues to be incredibly damaged, doesn't he? It's Turner from part 2. We see he's still shrunken, he's smaller, and he's thinner. But we have this wonderful reconciliation and this reunion and this picturing of the lovers together. I'm just going to quickly read the quote because it's so beautiful. Now with 2 hands she was gripping his cheeks tightly, and with an effort she turned his face and drew it towards her own. At last he was looking into her eyes, but still she kept her grip on his cheeks. She pulled him closer, drawing him into her gaze until their faces met, and she kissed him lightly, lingeringly on the lips. This really takes us into the romance genre, doesn't it? And it represents love as a form of rehabilitation, love as making you... Okay, we were discussing the rehabilitation of love idea, and this is a beautiful quote. With the tenderness that Bryony remembered from years ago, waking in the night, Cecilia said, "Come back, Robbie, come back." Beautiful, and you will remember it from part 2. This is how metafiction works, because later she admits that is what Cecilia said to her to comfort her in the night. So we see this imagined scene and how it works. Bryony takes the words that she knows that Cecilia can say, and she projects them onto Robbie. And it is, as I said, a beautiful scene, and we all love love stories, and it seems to be working within the paradigm of poetic justice, doesn't it? Remember in the trials of Arabella, people get what they deserve. There's a kind of karma going. And here Robbie and Cecilia get that love and reunion that they so desperately require. Later, when we find out that it's not true, that's what I ask you to think about yourself, you know. Some readers dislike the book after that because they feel cheated. I actually think it's a beautiful scene, and I think one of the ways that we can rehabilitate and forgive Bryony is to see the amount of effort that she puts into the recreation of this love scene. And you'll recall, I haven't put the quotation down here, but interestingly, when she writes of herself, she talks about shrinking and wanting to leave the room and knowing that she doesn't belong there. And later in part 4, she says, I wasn't such a liar as to make them forgive me. Now, perhaps an element of that atonement is the idea of not contriving forgiveness. Because one of the ways that we can see her life is a kind of lifelong punishment, isn't it? And to me, that's very moving. Right, moving on. So, is part 3 pure fiction? Do we just see it as a kind of literary construct? Kirsten earlier actually used the word fake, didn't she? Yeah? And I'm going to use this as an example of AO5, where we can actually debate that and see whether we think that that is valid or not, okay? So, due to her novel being her atonement for what she did to her sister and her medical prince, Bryony has tried to do them justice. Robbie and Bryony's love, as the central theme of the novel, is in part Bryony's attempt to give them, in fiction, what they lost in life. A way for her to give them their happiness. Now, if Kirsten is right, that's just a poor substitute. It's entirely imaginary. It's not valid. Possibly another way of seeing this is to actually argue that that labor of love does have some kind of validity, if only because it shows that she has become a better person and she thinks very carefully about the things. And it is what makes her a novelist as well. We know, don't we, that this is her life's work. I mean, one of the things I think that McEwan is saying is that every writer has one particular book which is their life's work. Now, we know, don't we, that Bryony goes on to be a very famous novelist and is highly acclaimed. But this is the novel that she almost in a kind of fetishized way writes over and over again. She begins it in January 1940. Which version was that? Do you remember?
The draft she sent to Cyril.
Yeah, to Cyril. So there's this idea of the novel simply being this one draft of the Fountain Sea. Interestingly enough, that's how McEwan wrote it as well, didn't he? He says that he wrote the Fountain Sea and then left it and didn't know what to do with it. Okay, think about the relationship between McEwan and between Bryony. It's very interesting, isn't it? And then half a dozen different drafts. The second draft, 1947. The third, who cares? My 59-year-old assignment is over. That would be the quote to remember, I think. 59-year assignment. Okay. This was our crime. Lola's, Marshall's, mine. And from the second version onwards, I set out to describe it. Interestingly, I think that you notice she puts Lola first. Incredibly unforgiving of Lola. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? In terms of gender politics, there's no sense of sisterhood or an attempt to find empathy with Lola. I think as a class, we probably have more empathy with Lola. We think of her, as you know, on the cusp of puberty, as herself going through a painful divorce, as the product of the 1930s. Bryony judges her incredibly harshly, doesn't she? And she places her before Marshall. Now, you might argue that Marshall would be better placed as the first name. I find that very interesting. But Bryony reminds us that she's not so self-serving as to let them forgive her, which indicates that the main purpose of her imagined meeting with the couple is not to defend herself, but simply to seek a forgiveness that neither her sister nor Robbie provided her with in life. And the character Bryony is described to be in part of the conversation she had rehearsed, partly indicating that the author, Bryony, has indeed imagined this meeting taking place a number of times. Over and over imagined this, okay? So if you want somebody to be rehabilitated through the paradigm of atonement, surely it's the constant suffering and the learning that has occurred. So this is why we can see atonement as one drawn-out Bildungsroman, can't we? In which Bryony moves from ignorance and from shallowness to kind of wisdom by the end of the novel. And I would suggest that the circularity of the novel, the fact that we return to the trials of Arabella, shows that that journey has been complete. And if we as readers are to get some satisfaction from the novel, it will be the notion that Bryony can go to sleep and fade into her dementia having served her time, so to speak, like Robbie had to serve his. Now, she talks with great honesty as well, doesn't she? I try to persuade my reader by direct or indirect means that Robbie Turner died of septicemia at Bray Dunes on the 1st of June 1940, and that Cecilia was killed in September of the same year by the bomb that destroyed Balham Underground Nation. That I never saw them in that year, that my walk across London ended at the church on Clapham Common. What a much sadder story that is, isn't it? Robbie and Cecilia dead, Paul Marshall and Lola having their high-class wedding, the truth hidden forever, Robbie and Cecilia erased from history, the terribleness, the completeness of death. And she says that she tried to persuade her reader. You could argue that that's a bit disingenuous. You could really agree with Kirsten and say, again, that's fake. That she's actually made up a story. And that in this case, you'll see that Bryony is actually saying, she sort of infers it, doesn't she, that it was her reader that insisted upon this different ending. That would be a kind of harsh kind of criticism of Bryony. Another way of seeing it is to say that she felt, once again, that her atonement required her to give them this love scene that they'd lost in everyday life. And you will recall that she spent so much time rehearsing part 2 and researching it. You'll remember that she first of all is writing in Bedlam, do you remember that? Which is a kind of madhouse. And maybe that suggests her anguish and emotional pain as she writes. But because she really wants to give them a gift, she tries to write with a sense of truth and realness that she certainly didn't do when she wrote the Trials of Arabella. Do you remember that she actually researched every single thing, and she used nettle, didn't she? She tries to get even the military equipment right, doesn't she? The slang that they used. And this remarkable work of research is meant to show the depth of her sorrow. And it's meant to be the tribute that she gives to them by fashioning something beautiful, accurate, precise, a wonderful work of art. She hopes that this will be some recompense to them. I also wanted to point out in part 4, McEwan introduces us into a new character, Michael, and I think he's there for a reason, isn't he? We're reminded of the incredible progress that Britain has made, aren't we? So we're in 1999 now, aren't we? McEwan has chosen that year for a reason, hasn't he? It's the coming of a new millennium. What has occurred in those 70 years? Well, we see from the Country House novel, which is white, isn't it? Homogeneous, no inkling of any kind of pluralism, etc. Bryony was happy in that world. It was a world that she knew. She was suspicious of outsiders. Arguably, one of the reasons why she becomes suspicious of Robbie is that he doesn't follow the script, does he? He's a hybrid creature, isn't he? You know, she sees him as a woodcutter. When he actually becomes a kind of potential sexual partner to her sister, he's actually gone out of the roles that she sees. But I think it's quite interesting. I think McEwan's very clever in part 4, because at first he presents Bryony as this sort of upper-class white woman who doesn't like this pluralistic world. She asks Michael to turn down his music, which is such a sort of typical storyline, isn't it, of an old generation going, I don't like your loud, horrible music. That, I think, would disappoint us as readers because it wouldn't show her growing. It wouldn't be the Bildungsroman. Instead, however, she shows that she's perfectly comfortable with Michael and this new world. She seems to be someone who wouldn't have voted Brexit, who actually embraces multicultural Britain. And Michael himself is, of course, a very interesting character, because do we see a black taxi driver who listens to rap that's too loud so that we can stereotype another black man? Or do we look beyond that and see that Michael, in fact, is completing a PhD from LSE, one of the top universities in the world? And Bryony herself recognizes the complexity of her being. Now, before that, she thought in terms of shallow archetypes, didn't she, in part 1? And that's what condemned Robbie. Now she sees through that. She sees complexity. And you recall, when she's an adult, mature novelist, she's known for reserving judgments. It's precisely what she didn't do in part one. I saw him, she says. She realizes now that perception is subjective, that perception is flawed. She no longer believes in the intrusive author who pulls the strings like a puppet. Do you remember that was her model? Now she's somebody who creates something and tries to move outside of it, and she tries not to be such a visible author. We see very symbolically that Michael takes us back to Tallis House. So there's a beautiful circularity to the novel, isn't there? We return to where we began, back in the same location, back with the same play. Now the play is actually going to be shown after all of these years, remarkably. But the Tallis House is no longer the place of the country house, is it? It's turned from that into a rather vulgar-sounding hotel, doesn't it? And I think there's a golf course as well, isn't there? And I think that this is meant to show this disintegration of the country house. And it's inconceivable that we could have a country house novel set in the post-war period. It's as though that side of British fiction was forever lost. The notion that you could be secluded in this green and pleasant place, and that you could keep all of the problems and the modern world outside has gone. Even the gates were melted, weren't they, to make Spitfires. Do you remember during the Second World War? It's literally like that Britain has been melted away and no longer exists. And finally, this is highly metafictional once again. We're left with the trials of Arabella. And it's meant to be a kind of beautifulness here, because Bryony watches her play, and I think the purpose of it is that she forgives herself. She comes to terms with her earlier self. She no longer perhaps hates herself. And that is why, dear class, I think we should not judge Bryony too harshly, because I think the whole theme of the novel is the notion that perception is subjective, perception is flawed. And no doubt when Bryony saw Robbie raping Lola, no doubt she did see Robbie raping Lola, because she convinced herself of that particular idea. Khalas.